Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with a video that I've been seeing going around here on YouTube. I'm not sure who created it though, so if you do know that, let me know down below. But it's going to be all the eyeshadow palettes that I did not use in 2021, and as you're going to see soon, I don't have too many palettes in that category, so I also decided to include all of the eyeshadow palettes that I only used one shade in. That is usually because I roll it into my Panos eyeshadows or something similar, because there's quite a few palettes as well that I only used one shade in, which I thought would just be fun to include, because obviously I only use those palettes because they roll into a project and not because, you know, I reach for them on my own. So that is what I decided to do. But before we jump into the palettes, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. But let's jump into the video. So out of all of the palettes that I have in my collection, there's only 3 that I did not reach for last year, and I have them right here. So I'm gonna go through them in order and yeah, talk through them. The first one I have here on top is my gold palette by Huda Beauty. It's the gold obsession palette, and I bought this not last year but the year before, and I really enjoy this. I think the year before I did use every single shade in it. I had it in my 1 week 1 palette series, and I enjoy this palette loads, but I just did not reach for it last year. And I think that's because, I mean, the color story is beautiful. It has like those mauve tones, those gold tones, but it's just it's a small palette. It's one that I can probably dupe out in my collection, and that's I think why I haven't reached for it. But I'm definitely gonna make an effort to reach for this year. It's gonna be a beautiful like travel palette or something like that. And yeah, I'm excited to have this in my collection, and I really need to make a mental note to reach for this. The last 2 palettes are both palettes I actually picked up last year and I just haven't played with. This next one is actually a free gift with purchase that I got from Sydney Grace when I placed an order back in July, and I think it arrived to me in August last year, and that is the Sweet Indulgence palette. This was, like I said, a free gift with purchase on one of their days of Christmas in July, and this is what the palette looks like. It's beautiful. I've been considering making this into singles though, because all of the eyeshadows in here are magnetic, but for now I want to keep it as it is, and I actually want to play around with the palette as it is before I make that decision. But I did not reach for it last year, and I think the reason why I didn't is because it was a gift with purchase. I did not really like pick this up myself, and therefore I didn't really have the desire to reach for this, if that makes sense. But I'm gonna make an effort this year and at least use it as a whole, and I feel like it doesn't really work together. I'm gonna depot this into singles and then decide what shades to keep and what not to keep. But that is the second palette I did not reach for at all last year. Then the very final palette that I did not reach for at all last year is quite a sad one, to be honest, because of what brand this is and what palette it is, and that is my Natasha Denona Love palette. Yes, it is a Natasha Denona palette, and I did not reach for this at all last year. But I think the reason why I didn't reach for it last year is because I got this in November, I think, or something like that, quite late in the year last year, and I bought this off of eBay. It was very lightly used and I got it on a really good discount, but I did not reach for it myself. So I do want to reach for it this year. I have not yet reached for it this year, which is a bit of a shame, because we are now in March and we have lost the time in February, which is where I think this palette would have been perfect, because it is a love palette. It came out as a Valentine's release, but I think this is definitely a palette I can reach for anyway this year, and I'm really gonna make an effort. I'm gonna try putting some of these shades into my BYOP maybe, or just reach for it as a whole. But I definitely need to reach for this palette because it is a Natasha Denona palette, and I was so excited to get this. I really wanted it for such a long time, and now I haven't reached for it yet. So this is probably the most shameful palette I did not use, but I'm still excited to have it within my collection. I just need to make a mental note to reaching for this. So next up we have the palettes that I, like I said, have only used one shade in. So I want to go through those, and I do actually have 6 of those palettes. So again, I mean, there are a few, but not too bad, depending, especially considering I was panning so many eyeshadows last year and I was focusing on hitting pan rather than using my whole palette. But I'm just gonna go through them in again the order that I have them in the pile. So the first palette that I have is my Nude Light palette by Huda Beauty. This is the palette that I actually picked up last year, so I haven't had it in my collection for that long, but I only used one shade in this last year, which is the one that I have pan on, and that is actually also the only eyeshadow in this palette that I've reached for. But yeah, that is the first one, and I really enjoy that shade, and this is again a palette I really wanted for such a long time. But yeah, I just didn't get a chance to reaching for it last year, so I'm gonna again make an effort to reaching for this more this year. Another palette that I only reached for one shade in is my Golden Coconut palette by Colourpop. I think actually the remaining eyeshadow palettes here are Colourpop, so definitely not palette that I reached for on my own very much, apart from the main projects. But that is, like I said, a Golden Coconut palette, and the shade that I reached for in here is the shade Palm Reader, which is the light shade up here. I'm currently working on this shade though, so I am using a bit more of the palette this year, but yeah, like I said, Palm Reader is a shade in here that I reached for, but I did not reach for the rest of the palette. But again, this was in my 1 week one palette the year prior, so I did use it in 2020, just not in 2021, and I have reached for all of these shades at least once. Next palette is actually one of my kind of Franken palettes, and that is my Colourpop More palette, but it is no longer the More palette. It used to be a mix between the More and the Soul palette, but I have since switched in another shade as well, and this is what it looks like. In this one I only reached for one of the shades as well. I'm trying to think which one it was. I think, was it Gridlock that I had in a project? I think it might have been a different one actually. No, I think that's the one of the shades that I did pull out, which was like a red shimmer. So the shades in here I have not used. I did use this shade here though, which is, I guess, kind of represent the red shade that I pulled out, because this used to be, like I said, a red shade, and that is the one I used. But I did also use this shade last year, so I guess again it's only one of the shades that I've used in this palette. But again, that is another palette that I only reached for one shade. All of this is not like a pre-made palette or anything, so it's, I don't know if it counts in this video or anything, but since it is in my palette collection, I thought I would include it anyway. Next up we have more Colourpop palettes. We have two more of the 9 palettes, and next up is the Aha Honey palette. This is the yellow toned monotone palette, and in here again I only used for one shade last year, and that is the shade Queen Bee. This was in my A to Z project pan, and I did hit pan on it, but I did not use the rest of the palette, so again it's a bit neglected. I don't even know if I've used all these shades on my eyes, so that is kind of why I want to rotate through my palettes more this year and make an effort to actually using, basically, not, I don't know if I can use all of my eyeshadows this year, but I'm gonna really try to make an effort to do so, because yeah, I don't want to have palettes with shades that are completely untouched and not even trialed, which I do still have in this palette. Then the last 9 pan palette from Colourpop that I have in this list is my La Like You A Lot palette. I really like this palette, and I have used it quite a lot in the past, but last year I only used one of the shades, which is the shade down here, which is called Iffy. Again, it was in my A to Z project pan, and it's probably one of my favorite eyeshadows in this palette. And I really, like I said, love this palette, but I just did not reach for it very much last year. I'm kind of getting away from using these monotone palettes from Colourpop because they're not very versatile, but this is just a really nice palette, and this shade here in the middle is stunning. I keep staring at it, it's so pretty, but I definitely want to reach for this more, and I think I should probably try to reach for it now in like March, April, because it is a very spring tone palette with the purples in here. So I'm gonna try to make, again, a mental note to reach for this in the next kind of month or two. Then we come to the very final palette of my list, and that is my Sweet Talk palette by Colourpop. This is one of the Colourpop palettes that has always rated top of my list, so I do really like this one as well, but I just forget about it. It's more of a summer palette, and then last summer I reached for other things, I guess. But again, I'm going to try to reach for this more this year, but this is what it looks like. And again, the eyeshadow I reached for is one that was in a project, and that is the shade Side to Side, which I do not have pan on. But it's a really nice corally kind of palette, but I didn't reach for it last year. I think this was actually also in one of my 1 week one palette the year prior, so I'm starting to see a theme that the palette that I used in 2020 a lot and reached for like all the shades, so I had like in my 1 week one palette where I used them exclusively, I kind of neglected in 2021, which is interesting, and I don't know what that says about me or my usage, but yeah, I can definitely see a theme, because obviously I did have a few more palettes that I had in that project, but majority of them are actually on this list. So I think that kind of means that I think I thought that I maybe used them last year but didn't, because I used them the year prior and in my project, and it just felt like more recent than it was. But anyway, that is the last palette on my list, and it's also, like I said, the last palette that I only used one shade in. So to sum up, I did have, like I said, 3 palettes that I did not use at all last year, which, I mean, isn't great, but it's still better, I think, than what I expected. And then I have 6 palettes where I only use 1 shade, which again isn't great, and it's probably a bit more alarming than the 3 that I did not use at all. But again, one of my main goals this year is to rotate through my palettes more and use like every shade in a palette, which is also why I wanted to introduce the Product Level Up project that I'm doing this year, because then you have to use every single shade in a palette. So hopefully I'm going to rotate through most of these palettes this year, and I'm going to put an extra focus on using these specifically because I did not use them at all last year, or like I maybe used 1 shade, but I did not use majority of these shades last year, so I'm going to make an effort this year to use them. And if I don't reach for them this year, I think it probably means that I need to declutter them by the end of this year, because if I did not use them at all this year, that means that I basically did not reach for them at all in 2 years time, which should give me a hint of what to declutter at the end of this year. But that was it for this video. If you had any palettes that I did not use last year, let me know what they are down below. But otherwise, I will catch you in my next one. Bye guys.